They say 3 people can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. But what happens when guilt becomes heavier than silence? When the weight of knowing crushes a soul until the only relief is confession? Tonight, we're diving into 6 cases where decades of silence shattered in a single moment, where someone who swore they'd never tell finally opened their mouth and changed everything. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button. Why? Because at the end of this video, I'm revealing something that will completely change how you think about cold cases and the psychology of confession. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for this one. Picture a summer day in August 2000. Susan Carter, a 41-year-old mother, and her 10-year-old daughter, Natasha, who went by Alex, were going about their daily lives in West Virginia. August 8th started like any other day, but by nightfall, both mother and daughter had vanished without a trace. The investigation began immediately. Detectives interviewed friends, family, neighbors. They searched properties, followed up on tips, chased down every possible lead. But Susan and Alex had simply disappeared, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. The case went cold, but for Susan's family, the agony never diminished. They held vigils, kept the case in the public eye, never stopped searching for answers. Here's what makes this case extraordinary. The man who knew exactly what happened was living his life, carrying on as normal, the secret buried deep, literally and figuratively. Larry Webb had known Susan Carter. They'd had some kind of dispute, something about missing money that escalated into rage. For nearly 24 years, Larry Webb kept his silence. He watched as the community searched. He saw the missing persons posters. He knew that beneath his backyard in Mabscott, West Virginia, lay the answers everyone was desperately seeking, and he said nothing. Flash forward to April 2024, Larry Webb was dying. Age and illness had caught up with him, and he knew his time was running out. When reporters had approached him earlier about the case, he'd claimed not to remember anything, blaming dementia. But as death approached, something shifted. In early April 2024, Webb's conscience, or perhaps his fear of divine judgment, finally broke through decades of silence. He confessed to investigators. He admitted that he'd shot Susan Carter over a dispute about missing money. Then, to cover up that murder, he'd killed 10-year-old Alex, an innocent child who'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He told authorities where to find their remains, buried in his own backyard, where they'd been for nearly a quarter century. On April 22, 2024, investigators arrived at Webb's property and began excavating. The same day, the very same day, Larry Webb died. He'd held on to his secret for 24 years, confessed with just weeks left to live, and drew his final breath as investigators were uncovering the evidence of his crimes. The remains of Susan and Natasha Alex Carter were recovered from that backyard, ending nearly 24 years of agonizing uncertainty for their family. At a press conference, law enforcement confirmed what the family had feared but needed to know. Susan and Alex had been murdered, and their killer had lived among them all this time, carrying his terrible secret until the very end. What finally broke Larry Webb's silence after all those years? Was it genuine remorse, fear of facing his maker with that burden on his soul, or simply the recognition that he had nothing left to lose? We'll never know what was going next his mind in those final weeks. But we know that when silence finally broke, it brought closure to a family that had waited nearly a quarter century for answers. The timing of Webb's death, on the exact day the remains were found, adds a haunting coda to this tragedy. He confessed just in time to direct investigators to the truth, but not in time to face earthly justice. He escaped a courtroom, a trial, a prison cell, but he couldn't escape the weight of what he'd done. And in the end, that weight was apparently too heavy to carry into whatever comes next. For Susan's family and friends, for little Alex who never got the chance to grow up, the confession brought a bittersweet resolution. They finally knew. After 24 years of not knowing, of imagining every horrible possibility, of hoping against hope that somehow they were still alive somewhere, they finally had the truth. It wasn't the truth they'd hoped for, but it was truth nonetheless. They say 3 people can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. Larry Webb proved that one person can keep a secret for decades, but even the strongest silence eventually crumbles. Sometimes it takes a lifetime. Sometimes it takes the approach of death. Guilt works on the conscience like water on stone, slowly, persistently, wearing down even the hardest surfaces. But sometimes it's not the killer who breaks. Sometimes the truth comes from someone standing in the shadows, someone who witnessed evil and stayed silent until they couldn't anymore. College should be about discovery, freedom, the best years of your life. For 19-year-old Kristin Smart, a freshman at California Polytechnic State University, it became something else entirely. An ending without an epilogue, a story interrupted mid-sentence. May 25, 1996, an off-campus party. Music, drinks, young people celebrating the approach of summer. Kristin had too much to drink. Two fellow students, Paul Flores and Cheryl Anderson, walked her back toward her dorm around 2 a.m. Somewhere along that walk, Kristin Smart vanished into thin air. She was never seen again. Paul Flores was the last person seen with her. He told police she was pretty intoxicated and that he'd walked her as far as his dorm before they parted ways. His story had holes you could drive a truck through, but without a body, without physical evidence, prosecutors had nothing. Paul Flores went on living his life. Kristin's family went on dying inside, one day at a time. For 25 years, this case festered. Kristin's father, Stan Smart, became obsessed with finding his daughter. He investigated on his own, created websites, kept the case alive in public consciousness when law enforcement seemed to move on. Paul Flores was the obvious suspect, but obvious and provable are two different things entirely. Then something remarkable happened. In 2019, a podcast called Your Own Backyard began examining Kristin's disappearance. Host Chris Lambert spent years researching, interviewing, digging through every detail. The podcast generated massive public interest and, more importantly, it shook something loose. Witnesses who'd been too scared to talk in 1996 suddenly felt emboldened. College students who kept secrets out of misplaced loyalty or fear now had families of their own. They understood what the Smart family had endured. The podcast gave them cover, a reason to finally speak up. People came forward with crucial information. Witnesses described Paul Flores acting suspiciously around the time of Kristin's disappearance. One described him as extremely nervous and sweaty just hours after Kristin vanished. Another reported seeing him with a mysterious black eye the next day, an injury he couldn't adequately explain. But the most devastating testimony came from someone Paul himself had confided in. Jennifer Hudson testified that Paul Flores had told her he'd buried Kristin under the ramp at his place in Wasna. The confession was direct, chilling, and impossible to dismiss. Someone who'd carried that knowledge for years finally found the courage to come forward. Additional witnesses emerged with pieces of the puzzle. Paul's former roommate, David Stone, testified about Ruben Flores' suspicious behavior, how Ruben had become angry when Stone moved barrels under the deck at Ruben's home, and disturbing comments Ruben had made about Kristin. The implication was clear. Ruben had helped his son hide the evidence of his crime. In 2021, police arrested both Paul and Ruben Flores. Prosecutors alleged that Paul had killed Kristin during or after a sexual assault, and that Ruben had helped hide her body, likely burying it beneath his deck before moving it later. During the search of Ruben's property, forensic experts found soil disturbances consistent with a body having been buried and removed. The trial in 2022 became a moment of reckoning. Without Kristin's body, prosecutors built their case on the cumulative weight of circumstantial evidence and testimony from people who'd finally found the courage to speak. Paul Flores was convicted of first-degree murder. Ruben was acquitted of being an accessory, but the verdict on Paul brought a measure of justice. What broke the silence after 25 years? Part of it was time. People's priorities and courage change as they age. Part was the podcast creating a community of attention that made witnesses feel less alone. But mostly it was collective guilt finally becoming heavier than collective fear. Those witnesses had carried their knowledge for a quarter century. When they finally spoke, they gave the Smart family what they'd been fighting for: acknowledgement that their daughter's life mattered. that her death wasn't forgotten, that justice, however delayed, was still possible. Sometimes the person who finally talks isn't a witness to the crime. Sometimes they're an accomplice, someone who helped cover up evil and spent years looking over their shoulder, wondering when the knock on the door would finally come. Los Angeles, 1986. Sherri Rasmussen was living the dream. Newlywed, successful career as a nursing director, a beautiful home in Van Nuys. On February 24th, her husband John came home from work to find their home ransacked and Sherri dead on the living room floor, shot 3 times. Police investigated it as a burglary gone wrong. Case closed, filed away, forgotten. Except it wasn't a burglary, and certain people knew it from day one. Sherri's father, Nels Rasmussen, told detectives to look at Stephanie Lazarus, an LAPD officer who'd been romantically involved with John Ruetten before his marriage to Sherri. Nels explained that Stephanie had been obsessed with John, had confronted Sherri multiple times, had even shown up at the hospital where Sherri worked to warn her to stay away. The dots weren't just easy to connect, they were screaming to be connected. But Stephanie Lazarus was one of their own. She wore the badge, and the LAPD, consciously or unconsciously, looked the other way. They stuck with the burglary theory despite evidence that nothing valuable was taken. Despite the obvious signs of a personal rage-fueled attack, despite bite marks on Sherri's arm that suggested a woman had attacked her. For 23 years, Stephanie Lazarus lived a normal life. She continued working for the LAPD, eventually rising to the rank of detective. She married, seemed happy. Meanwhile, the Rasmussen family lived with the knowledge that their daughter's killer walked free, protected by the blue wall of silence. Then in 2009, something shifted. Cold case detective Jim Nuttall started reviewing old murders. DNA technology had advanced exponentially since 1986. Nuttall found the swab taken from the bite mark on Sherri's arm, evidence that had sat in storage for over 2 decades. He ran it through the system. No match in the criminal database. But Nuttall had a hunch. He started investigating Stephanie Lazarus, now a respected veteran of the force. The challenge was getting her DNA without tipping her off. Detectives followed her to Costco and retrieved a cup she'd thrown away. The DNA matched the bite mark evidence perfectly. The arrest in 2009 sent shockwaves through the LAPD. One of their own, a decorated detective, was a murderer who'd hidden behind her badge for over 2 decades. But here's the twist. Stephanie never officially confessed. She maintained her innocence throughout the trial. So who talked? In this case, it wasn't a person but evidence. Specifically DNA evidence that couldn't stay silent. However, what really broke the case open was something more human. Other officers who'd suspected the truth for years, finally pushing for justice once they had the scientific backing to do so. During the investigation, witnesses came forward who'd seen Stephanie's obsessive behavior toward John Ruetten. Colleagues admitted they'd always wondered about her, but had stayed quiet out of loyalty or fear. One former partner confessed that Stephanie had seemed off in the days after Sherri's murder, distracted and anxious in a way he'd never seen before. But he'd said nothing. The code of silence had protected a killer for 23 years. Stephanie Lazarus was convicted of first-degree murder in 2012 and sentenced to 27 years to life. At her sentencing, Sherri's family finally addressed the officers who'd buried the initial investigation, the colleagues who'd suspected but stayed silent, the entire system that had protected one of its own at the expense of justice. This case reveals a dark truth. Sometimes the silence that protects killers isn't just about fear or loyalty. Sometimes it's institutional, systematic, a wall built by people who should be the first to tear it down. And when that wall finally crumbles, what emerges is the ugly reality of how many people knew, how many suspected, how many turned away. Guilt and fear, these are the twin forces that keep secrets locked away. But there's a third force we haven't discussed yet: money. Sometimes the promise of reward can accomplish what conscience alone cannot. You probably know this case from the Netflix documentary, Making a Murderer. Stephen Avery, recently exonerated after spending 18 years in prison for a wrongful conviction, was arrested again for the murder of photographer Teresa Halbach. The case became a media sensation, polarizing the nation into camps of those who believed Avery was guilty and those who believed he'd been framed again. But there's an aspect of this case that didn't get as much attention as it deserved. The role of Brendan Dassey, Avery's 16-year-old nephew, whose confession became the most controversial element of the entire investigation. On October 31, 2005, Teresa Halbach arrived at the Avery salvage yard to photograph a van. She never left. 5 days later, her RAV4 was found on the property. Then her remains were discovered in a burn pit. Stephen Avery became the prime suspect almost immediately. But investigators needed more. They needed someone to talk. Enter Brendan Dassey, a learning disabled teenager with a low IQ who looked up to his uncle. In February 2006, detectives pulled Brendan out of school for questioning. What happened in that interrogation room has been debated ever since. Was it a legitimate confession or a coerced false statement from a vulnerable kid who told police what they wanted to hear? Brendan described helping Stephen rape and murder Teresa, providing details that seemed to confirm investigators' theories. But here's what haunts this case. Much of what Brendan confessed didn't match the physical evidence. He described shooting Teresa in the bedroom and stabbing her, but no blood evidence supported this. He seemed to be guessing, offering scenarios until investigators indicated he was on the right track. The interrogation tapes reveal something chilling. You can watch a 16-year-old boy, intellectually limited and clearly confused, being led through a story by experienced investigators. At one point after confessing to rape and murder, Brendan asked what time his school bus would be coming, as if he didn't understand the magnitude of what had just happened. Both Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey were convicted. Avery continues to maintain his innocence and has multiple appeals pending. Brendan's conviction has been challenged repeatedly, with courts questioning whether his confession was voluntary or coerced. In 2016, a federal judge overturned Brendan's conviction, ruling his confession was involuntary, but that decision was later reversed on appeal. What makes this case different from the others? Brendan talked, yes, but did he tell the truth or simply tell a story that satisfied his interrogators? This case forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. When someone finally talks, how do we know they're telling the truth? How do we distinguish between genuine confession and coerced compliance? Multiple witnesses and family members have since come forward to describe Brendan's vulnerabilities, his suggestibility, his desperate desire to please authority figures. They describe a boy who would agree to almost anything if he thought it would make adults happy or let him go home. The Teresa Halbach murder remains officially solved, but the controversy around how that solution was obtained continues. This case serves as a cautionary tale about the danger of confessions obtained under questionable circumstances, reminding us that sometimes when someone finally talks, we need to ask ourselves, are they talking because they have truth to tell, or because they can't endure the pressure of silence anymore, even if it means confessing to something they didn't do? Not all confessions come from guilt or coercion. Sometimes people talk for the simplest reason imaginable. They want the credit. They want the recognition for what they've done, even if what they've done is monstrous. This case changed America forever. It led to nationwide reforms in how we handle missing children cases, created one of the most recognized child safety advocacy organizations in history, and launched John Walsh's career as host of America's Most Wanted. But for decades, the question of who actually killed 6-year-old Adam Walsh remained unanswered, tangled in leads and suspects and frustration. July 27, 1981, Sears department store in Hollywood, Florida. Adam's mother, Reeve, was shopping and let Adam watch older boys play video games in the toy department. She was gone for 7 minutes. When she returned, Adam was gone. A security guard had kicked out the boys for being too rowdy, and Adam had apparently followed them outside. He vanished without a trace. 2 weeks later, fishermen found Adam's severed head in a canal 120 miles away. His body was never recovered. The investigation became a nightmare of missed opportunities and bungled leads. Multiple suspects emerged over the years, including serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, but none could be definitively connected to the crime. The prime suspect was Otis Toole, a drifter and serial killer who'd been working as a roofer in the area at the time of Adam's disappearance. Toole had a history of confessing to crimes, sometimes truthfully, sometimes not. He was unreliable, manipulative, and by his own admission, committed horrific acts. He confessed to killing Adam Walsh multiple times, then recanted, then confessed again. Toole's confessions contained details that hadn't been made public. He described abducting Adam from the Sears store, described the location where he'd left Adam's remains. But he was also a proven liar who confessed to murders he couldn't possibly have committed. Investigators were stuck in a maddening limbo. They believed Toole was the killer, but they couldn't prove it conclusively. Otis Toole died in prison in 1996, taking the definitive truth with him. But the story doesn't end there. In 2008, after reviewing all the evidence, the Hollywood Police Department officially closed the Adam Walsh case, naming Otis Toole as the killer. What led to this conclusion 27 years after the murder? It came down to the accumulation of confessions and corroborating evidence. Toole's confessions, despite his recantations, contained consistent details that matched the crime scene. A prison informant came forward describing how Toole had bragged about the killing, providing details he shouldn't have known. Most convincing was the discovery that Toole had been driving a white van, matching witness descriptions, and that he'd left Florida shortly after Adam's disappearance. A suspicious coincidence. But here's the complicated truth. We'll never know with absolute certainty. Toole's confessions could have been a cry for attention from a man who craved notoriety and found it through claiming a responsibility for heinous crimes. Or they could have been the unburdening of a guilty conscience, moments of honesty from a deeply disturbed individual. John Walsh accepted the police department's conclusion, but has said he believes there were others involved in covering up the crime. The case that defined his life remains, in some ways, unresolved even after being officially closed. It reminds us that sometimes when people finally talk, what they say raises as many questions as it answers. The Adam Walsh case fundamentally changed how America handles missing children cases, leading to the creation of Code Adam protocols, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and the Adam Walsh Child Protection Act. Sometimes the impact of a crime, and of someone finally talking about it, extends far beyond the courtroom. Our final case takes us into the darkest territory we've explored yet. Sometimes silence protects not just one murderer, but an entire criminal enterprise built on violence and fear. And when that silence breaks, entire organizations crumble. December 16, 1985, rush hour in Manhattan. Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino crime family, stepped out of his Lincoln in front of Sparks Steakhouse. He never made it through the door. 3 men in trench coats and Russian fur hats emerged from the crowd and shot him repeatedly, execution style. His bodyguard, Thomas Bilotti, was killed beside him. The gunman disappeared into the Manhattan evening, vanishing among the Christmas shoppers and commuters. It was one of the most brazen mob hits in American history. Everyone knew who'd ordered the hit. John Gotti, the ambitious underboss who wanted Castellano's throne, had the motive and the ruthlessness. But knowing and proving are very different things. The mob operates on omerta, the code of silence. You don't talk to cops, you don't testify, you take prison over betrayal. Violate omerta and you don't live long enough to regret it. For years, the Castellano murder remained officially unsolved. Gotti became the new boss, flaunting his power, earning the nickname the Dapper Don for his expensive suits and media-friendly persona. He seemed untouchable, protected by fear and loyalty. Then someone broke. Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, Gotti's underboss and right-hand man, was facing serious charges. Federal prosecutors offered him a deal. Testify against Gotti and we'll put you in witness protection. The decision Gravano faced was stark. Life in prison or life in hiding, but life nonetheless. The alternative was likely death, either from the legal system or from Gotti himself. In 1991, Sammy the Bull did the unthinkable. He violated omerta. He told federal prosecutors everything, not just about the Castellano hit, but about decades of mob activity, murders, extortion, racketeering. His testimony was devastating, detailed, impossible to dismiss. He described Gotti ordering the Castellano hit, the planning that went into it, the execution, the aftermath. Gravano's confession didn't just solve one murder, It brought down an empire. John Gotti was convicted of multiple charges, including ordering Castellano's murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. He died behind bars in 2002. Dozens of other mob figures were convicted based on Gravano's testimony. The Gambino family was crippled. But here's the uncomfortable reality. Sammy the Bull was himself a confessed murderer multiple times over. He admitted to participating in 19 murders. The government made a deal with a monster to catch what they considered a bigger monster. Gravano served only 5 years in prison before being released into witness protection. He later violated the terms of his protection by becoming involved in drug trafficking and served additional time. What broke Sammy the Bull's silence? Self-preservation, certainly. But there's evidence that his relationship with Gotti had deteriorated, that he felt betrayed and disrespected. Surveillance tapes caught Gotti criticizing Gravano behind his back. Pride and ego factored in. He wanted revenge. The confession became a weapon. The Castellano murder case demonstrates how high the stakes can be when someone finally talks. Gravano's decision to break silence didn't just solve a cold case. It fundamentally altered the landscape of organized crime in America. But it also forced prosecutors and the public to grapple with moral complexities. Is justice served when you make deals with killers? Does the end justify the means? Multiple other mob associates have come forward in the years since, emboldened by Gravano's precedent. The code of silence, once absolute, has developed cracks. Men who would have died rather than testify now calculate their options differently. Gravano proved that omerta could be broken and that you could survive, physically, if not morally, the breaking of it. The murder of Paul Castellano remains one of the most significant mob hits in history, not just for the audacity of the act, but for what ultimately came from it. A demonstration that even the most feared criminal organizations are vulnerable when someone decides that their own life matters more than loyalty to a code. 6 cases. 6 long silences finally shattered. Decades of secrets spilling out in moments of weakness, courage, calculation, or desperation. These stories teach us something fundamental about human nature. Secrets are corrosive. They eat away at people from the inside. Given enough time, given the right pressure, given the right motivation, even the most closely guarded secrets eventually find their way into the light. Some of these people talked because guilt overwhelmed them. Others talked because fear for their own lives overcame their fear of consequences. Some talked because the promise of reward was too good to refuse. And some talked because staying silent was simply no longer an option their psyche could endure. For the families left behind, the parents, siblings, children, friends, these confessions brought a complicated mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, anger at years stolen, gratitude for finally knowing, but also a bittersweet recognition that knowing the truth doesn't erase the trauma of not knowing for so long. If you made it this far, you've earned the reveal I promised at the beginning. Here it is. Research shows that the average time between a crime and a confession in cold cases is approximately 15 to 20 years. But here's what's fascinating. The breakthrough moment, the actual decision to talk, usually happens in less than 5 minutes. Years of silence, decades of carrying a secret, and then in a matter of minutes, it all comes spilling out. Psychologists call this the catastrophic unburdening. The dam doesn't leak slowly. It collapses all at once. That means right now, as you're watching this, someone somewhere knows something about an unsolved crime. They've known for years, maybe decades, and they're approaching that 5-minute window where silence becomes impossible to maintain. A cold case that's been frozen for a generation might be on the verge of breaking open simply because someone can't carry the weight anymore. If you found these cases as fascinating as I did researching them, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We dive deep into true crime cases that will keep you up at night. Stories where justice delayed isn't justice denied, just justice waiting for someone to finally talk. Drop a comment below. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Are there other cold cases you want me to cover? And here's a question worth thinking about. If you knew something about a crime, how long could you stay silent? Days, years, decades? The truth is, silence has an expiration date. It always does. And when it finally breaks, everything changes. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, someone always knows something. It's just a matter of time before they tell.